right, it's 7 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started with our author discussion on UnLynched. So, for those of you who don't know, my name is LaKesha Womack. I am the founder of Rethinking Church Strategy. So, this is my little baby. Oh, my husband was like, your glasses have a glare. And I'm like, yeah, and I have bags under my eyes. But I am the founder of Rethinking Church Strategies. I am also a published author. I published 17 of my own books. I have helped to self-publish probably about 25 to 30 books. I lost count somewhere along the way. But of all the books that I have worked on, this is my baby. This is my favorite project. And I think it's because it deals with the issues that I'm most passionate about. So my other books are issues that I'm knowledgeable about or that I care about. But when it comes to the psychological well-being of the Black community, like that's something that really concerns me and really affects me deeply. So if you guys have any questions about the book, feel free to post your questions in the chat. As I said, if you want to come on screen and ask a question, we can definitely do that. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the work and why I decided, hey, Donna, and why I decided to write the book. So I think it was around 2008, maybe, one of my friends posted the Willie Lynch letters on his Facebook page. And I had never heard of the Willie Lynch letters. I never read them before. And when I read them, I was just like mortified. And people were just like, oh, you know, Willie Lynch wasn't a real person and the letters aren't real. And my stance was, it doesn't matter if Willie Lynch was real or not. It doesn't matter if the letters are real or not, but the strategies that they describe in the letters are things that actually happen to slaves. And the desired result that they have in the letters are the manifestations that we're seeing in the Black community right now. So it was to me like, okay, so if these things happen to us and we have not had any way to deal with it, and I think Michelle Alexander has a book around post-traumatic slave syndrome. And what it really identifies to us is that slavery was a very traumatic experience in the Black community. And there has not really been a way for us to heal from that trauma. Like we have been told to just get over it. You know, that was 100 years ago. But the ramifications of it are still evident in our community. And so when I looked at the Willie Lynch letters, like what the book does is it dissects like each section of the letter to really talk about, all right, this is what they were describing. And this is what happened to our community. And this is what they said would happen in the future. And here we are. So how do we then unlynch ourselves? So yeah, I have the t-shirt and I get some real crazy looks, like depending on where I go and I wear the shirt. But just as, you know, lynching is a thing, we have to also start to think about how do we unlynch ourselves? How do we get ourselves down from this noose that is being wrapped around our necks and choking the life out of our communities? And the reality is we have to figure out how do we build economic power? And I hear people say, you know, okay, so we got to buy Black and we need to do business with, you know, more Black business owners. But the reality is when you look at just a lot of times like our attitudes toward Black businesses, we sometimes think that they're inferior, or if we have a bad experience, we're less likely to patronize them again. We want a lesser price. We think that we should get a hookup. So the question becomes, why do we have these attitudes toward our own businesses? Why do we not see our businesses as just as successful, just as capable? And so really looking at this work, it's like, okay, what happened to destroy the trust in our community? And so some of the things that I post in the book are a little controversial. So if you don't have the book, I definitely encourage you to get a copy. You can go to my website and get it directly from me if you want an autographed version, or if you want to get it from Amazon, which you will probably get it a little bit quicker, then you can go there and order it. But we talk about the different components. And so the first component, like they talk about the making of a slave. And it was so interesting because they talk about how do you break the will of a person. And it's just so heartbreaking how they make the analogy between like a Black person and a horse that you have to break in. And when we look at even lynchings, modern day lynchings, which I consider like state sanctioned police brutality, when you look at modern day lynchings, they serve the same essential purpose. And it is to instill a level of fear in us. So they say, imagine if you take like the strongest, Black person like on your plantation, and rather than lynching them, what if you broke their spirit? What if you broke them physically? What if you broke them emotionally? What if you broke them mentally? And then the other slaves have to see that this person who they saw as like the epitome of strength is now broken. Then if I know that I'm not as strong and this person was broken, then what does that say that will happen to me? Some years ago, Kanye West said, slavery was a choice. And and this was part of our discussion from this morning. And a lot of people, were just like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. And, that's so horrible. What was he thinking? But when you think about how slavery has almost been sanitized, and how we don't really talk about like the brutality of slavery, then it is possible for people to think that slavery was a choice. It's like if you have 100 slaves on a plantation and you only have like 4 or 5, white people or masters or, plantation, whatever they call them, then why didn't those 100 people rise up against those plantation masters or against the white people? And it wasn't about their physical powers, but it was about the psychological trauma that had been inflicted upon them, that they were afraid. So if you see the strongest among you being beat down and having their spirit broken, then how are you going to say, oh yeah, I'm going to be the one? Like, I know that I'm weaker. I know that I don't have, as much courage. Hey, Levon, how do you then say, well, I'm going to be the one that's going to rise up? And that's what they did, either through lynching or through beatings. They would take the strongest person and they would break them. And that's what helped to keep the rest of the community in check, essentially. And so some of the other strategies that they talk about is pitting the light skin against the dark skin, pitting the old against the young. And they talked about that as long as we were separate, as long as we were constantly battling against each other, then we wouldn't band together. So that's how you get the notion of the house slave and the field slave. So as long as the house slave and the field slave were in competition with each other, they weren't working together. And it's sad because if you look at our communities now, you still see that. Like, at one point it was, the natural hair people against the people with, weaves or whatever. Or you have, the light skin against the dark skin people, or, we still have like, the old against the young. So as long as we're having these battles against each other, we can't battle what's being inflicted upon us from the outside, because we're constantly battling within our communities. And so that's one of the things that we have to get over, is understanding that we as a community have more in common than we do not have in common. We are more alike than we are different. And if you don't believe me, just talk to somebody long enough. If you have conversation with someone, you will find some commonality. There are very few people that I've ever had conversation with that there was just like no point of intersection between us. But that requires you to have conversation. Another area of the book that we talk about that I'm just, enamored with is like the genius of our DNA. So I remember some years ago where, Ebonics was a big thing, and people were just like, oh, I don't understand, why Black people can't just speak proper English. So then the question becomes, well, what's proper English? And where do we get this notion that the King James Version or the King's English is better than our ability to make up words? Because if you look at most of the slang that has been added to the dictionary, it's words that we have created from our culture. If you look at most of the dances, if you look at, all the Ishas and all of the, different spellings of names, like that is something that is so powerful in our DNA, that even though our parents, our grandparents, and possibly even our great-grandparents had never stepped foot in Africa, have no real connection to that culture, but we still retain the rhythm. We still retain, the desire to be colorful and the desire to be expressive. Like that still lives within us. However, the European standards of beauty and English and how we should behave have caused us to have a level of self-hate where we look down on people in our community who are expressive and creative. And that's why we added the worship and arts portion to the summit this year, because I realized, our creativity is something that sets us apart. It's something that we are known for, that we are celebrated for, until it gets to the point where other people decide, oh, that's too much. You're doing too much. You shouldn't be doing that. And then we take on their attitudes and say, oh, yeah, we shouldn't be doing that. Oh, yeah, we are doing too much. And it's like, but who says so? Why do we stop celebrating our own just because someone from the outside says that we shouldn't? I remember when they were talking about Oprah Winfrey possibly running for president. And then all of a sudden, these pictures surfaced of her with, what's the guy's name that was like a sexual predator or whatever. And my question became, so where did these pictures come from? Where did this narrative come from? Because I doubt very seriously that it was someone in the Black community who was like, oh, no, we don't want Oprah Winfrey. So a lot of times it's someone from the outside who's planting information within our community to keep us divided and to keep us separated and to keep us from coming together. So we go on to talk about the economy of being Black. So if we don't have trust in our community, then it's hard for us to start talking about economics. It's hard for us to start talking about, oh yeah, let's do business together. Let's establish a bank together, because there are Black banks in this country. But then we have to ask ourselves, why do we not bank Black? Why does there have to be like this whole initiative around police brutality to get us to even consider putting our money in Black banks? Why do we not invest in our own communities? There was a portion in the book where we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and the talented 10th. I believe, and, this is not something that is factual or that, I want anyone to say, oh, LaKesha said, because it's just something that I believe. But I believe that, civil rights was the beginning of the end for our community. Desegregation. When we were able to move outside of our communities, when communities started to become gentrified, and I think they talked about this also this morning, when they started building highways through our communities, when they started to decentralize our communities, when we no longer lived together, when we no longer did business with each other, and we started to scatter, then that's when we really started to lose economic power. When you look at most of the race riots, they were because of economics. It was because they saw Black communities building economic power, and they didn't want us to be financially independent. So hear me. They don't care about us protesting. They don't care about us, having a blackout or we're not going to shop for a day. What they care about is us building sustained economic power. Because when we no longer need their system, then that's when it becomes really problematic. But as long as we're dependent upon we can call it the matrix, the man, whatever you want to call it, but as long as we're a part of the system, and as long as our trillions of dollars in buying power is not going back into our own community, then yeah, they can be a little mad. They can protest. They can burn down buildings in their own communities, but at the end of the day, they know that they're still getting our dollars. So that's one of the things that we're working toward with Rethinking Churches, figuring out how do we help our churches become the center of building this economic power. Cedric Nelms did a presentation earlier today where he was talking about mini-prize. So that is ministries having social enterprise. How do we help ministries begin to develop business opportunities that will employ our people as well as be revenue generators, so then we can reinvest back in the community? We were in a session with Dr. Otis Moss today, and he was talking about for his church, and I had to write this down. He said when his church does any project, they have 3 questions. Is it Black? Is it green? And how does it affect mass incarceration? Because first they want to know, is the project supporting Black businesses? So he's like, whether it's a partnership, whether it's something that they're doing, how does it affect Black businesses? And then second, is it green? How does it affect the environment? Because what we don't talk about enough, we make it seem like climate change and environmental justice is a white issue, but it's really a Black issue. Because when you look at where landfills are placed, when you look at where power plants are placed, when you look at where contaminants to the environment, whether it's water or air or the soil, when you look at where most of those things are placed, they're normally in closer proximity to Black and low income communities. And a lot of times it's because we're not paying attention. I was a part of a group that was fighting against a landfill to come to a community because they found this rural town in Alabama and they decided that's where they were going to put the landfill, and they were going to bring all this trash from New York to put into the landfill. And they were like, oh no, it's not going to be any problems. But the more we dug into it, we saw that the liners that they were planning to use were not what they said they were going to be. I know in Birmingham, Alabama and North Alabama, they're fighting some climate issues based on where some, I think, power plants were placed. A lot of times when we look at the level of cancers in our community and we look at, how people are getting ill in our communities, we don't often make the correlation between the environment. It's not just food, but it's environment. Is there a power plant in that area? Are there toxins being released in the soil or in the water? So we have to look at those issues. So that's the second issue. And then the third issue he said that they look at is mass incarceration. Are you hiring, or do you have a policy that will allow people who have been previously incarcerated to become employed? Because we know that there are a lot of employers, and I think that they're starting now to ban the box, where you ask people if they've been convicted of a felon before. And a lot of times that's a way to keep people of color, Black people, from getting jobs, from getting apartments, from getting back on their feet after they serve their time. So we have to look at, as we're building ministry, if we're going to build these enterprise, how do we do this in a way that we build back up our communities? And I truly believe that if the church is going to survive, we have to look at the economic empowerment as well as the social impact that we're having in our communities. Because we know that it's hard to get a job. It's hard to get a job that pays a living wage. So why don't we start these jobs? One industry that I think is ripe right now is looking at cleaning services, especially, post-COVID. You can get certifications where you can, clean buildings to the standard that makes them safe for COVID. Why aren't we doing job training around that? Looking at, different trades that people need. When the church gets involved in helping people to build that economic power personally, as well as building businesses, then people will start to see the church as the center of their community again. But as long as we're taking a back seat and we're not doing the work to help unlynch our people, and we're allowing them to continue to be hung by a noose, and while they're being hung by the noose, we're picking their pockets because we're asking them to continue to give while they can't breathe. They can't pay their bills. They're struggling, but we're still asking for more. So how do we start to cut that rope? How do we start to liberate people truly and helping them to understand not only who they are in Christ, but who we are as a people, that our history did not begin with slavery, that we were not slaves, we were enslaved people. I saw a post once and it changed my whole concept around that language. They said, they didn't bring slaves to America. They brought doctors and lawyers and dentists and business owners and enslaved those persons. So we were not slaves, we were enslaved. Language matters. And that's another area that they talked about. If they keep our language separate. So when they brought the enslaved people over, they made sure that they couldn't communicate with each other. Because if they knew if they could communicate, then that would also allow them to band together and to build power. So they kept them from being able to communicate. So now, going back to the Ebonics, when we're like, oh yeah, you don't speak proper English, so I can't talk to you. And, you talk like white people, so I don't want to associate with you. That's just another barrier to keep us separate. But when we move past these differences and say, you know what, it's okay that you speak differently than me, what is our ultimate goal? What are we trying to accomplish together? Then they also talked, the letter also talks about the separation of family. How if you take the male and you allow him to breed with a woman and have children, and then you take him away from the plantation, they said that it would do two things to the woman. One, it would make her raise her daughters to be independent because she wouldn't want her daughter to be dependent on a man and go through what she went through again. And then secondly, it would make her coddle her son because she would want to protect him, because she wouldn't want him to leave like the father did. And it's sad to say, and this is one of those things that is controversial because people are just like, no, 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 no. But when you look at a lot of single parent households that are raised, that the children are predominantly raised by the mother, she teaches her daughter to be independent, whether it's verbally or if it's just through what she sees. As she sees her mom's handling it, her mom's, doing it, her mom's got it. So when I get a man, I can do it too. I don't have to have a man. I don't need a man. When the reality is, whether you're in a same-sex relationship or a heterosexual relationship, we need each other. Partnership is essential for economic reasons as well as for just stability. Scripture even tells us 2 is better than 1. But when we have this mindset that we don't need a man, that women say, I don't need a man. When you don't need someone, you treat them like a want. And if you just want something, if you get it, you get it. If you don't get it, you don't get it. But when you need something, then you actively work to keep it. You actively work to make sure that you have it. And then when we look at the way a lot of women are raising their sons, because no matter how great of a mother I am, I can never teach my son how to be a man. And so there are some things that I do that are probably overindulgent because I'm a mother, and that's what mothers do. We're nurturing. So when you have that balance of energy, then you're able to show your children the male as well as the female side. Again, I have nothing against same-sex relationships. They make it work. I can only speak from my experience in heterosexual relationships. But it's necessary for us to be able to see both sides, for a daughter to be able to see how her father treats her, because that's going to emulate the type of man she's going to date. Because what do they say? We marry our fathers. And most of the time when you look back, if your father was in your life, your husband is probably something like your father. And they say that men marry their mothers. So if the mother is overindulgent, doesn't require him to do anything, make sure that he's taken care of, then you have these men who don't feel compelled to get a job, don't feel compelled to go out and work because they've never seen the male figure in the family dynamic. And so they would take the male after he left the family and created, this dynamic and send him to another plantation to start another family. So my grandfather had 26 kids. 26 kids. He had family over here, family over there. And if some of us are honest, some of our grandparents did the same thing. Had different families and we try to make it seem like, because they were unfaithful or what have you. But we have to ask ourselves how much of that was passed down from what had been seen in previous generations. And I don't think that we think about like some of the things that happen in our communities, how much of that was passed down from the psychological manipulation that was inflicted upon us. How do we become more intentional about teaching our men what it means to be a husband? What does it mean to be a father? Because if you have a generation of men that have grown up in households with only a mother, you can't assume that they know what it means to be a husband or a father. Yes, some of them will say, I don't want to be, what my father was. I don't want to be absent. I want to do something different. But when do we show them what different looks like? When do we help them to model what it looks like to be in a 2-parent household? So that's why mentors are so important. That's why it's important for the church to step in, mentor these young men. If you see that there's a single woman raising a son by herself, offer to be a mentor. Offer to show him how to tie a tie. I don't know how to tie a tie for the life of me. Luckily, I have a husband now. And I told him when we got married, like, I need you. I need you to be that presence in my son's life because I know my limitations. So, if you guys have questions, post them in the chat. Otherwise, we're probably going to wrap up in the next few minutes. One of the things that makes this book probably different from other books that you're going to read is, again, I don't pretend to have the answers. But what I do is dissect the information and give you something to think about. And at the end of each section, there are questions that I like to call up for discussion. So you read a chapter and then you have questions. And the idea is that you can get a small group to read the book together and then to begin to have these discussions, because the solution that's going to work in your community may be different than the solution that's going to work in my community. We've hosted some book discussions online with different groups that wanted to read through the book with me. And so we would read a couple of chapters and then come and have a virtual discussion to talk about it. So you can do something like that. But at some point, we have to start to look deeper. We can't just keep saying, oh, you know, we don't want to do business with Black people and we just got to get over that. You can't get over it if we haven't dealt with the trauma that has led to this separation. If we haven't truly identified what are the systemic issues that are plaguing our communities and how do we start to deal with those things? Because otherwise, we're just going to keep putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds. We're going to keep having surface conversations, but we have to at some point start to get to the root of the issue. So the final sections deal with the making of an economic slave. So apparently Willie Lynch had a son. And so the son wrote the second letter. And so in that part, he starts to talk about how beholden Black people are to consumerism and how we're not investors, how we spend, how we have all these social organizations and church groups that are supposed to do all this good in the community, but where's their impact? I'm paraphrasing. He didn't actually say that, but he did say, you know, what are they actually doing for those groups? Like, these groups are celebrated for, you know, being around for 100 years or 200 years, but what impact have they had over that time period other than celebrating themselves? And so that's why, for me, I'm calling the church to a higher call. What are we going to do to have an impact? What are we going to do that 100 years from now, people can look back and say, this is the mark that the church left in the community. This is the change that the church made in the community. With everything that was going on, the church was not silent, but the church actually had an impact. The church changed the tide of what was happening. And we can't do that if we're not willing to confront what the issues are. So we have to speak truth to power. We have to ask the hard questions. You know, people were upset on my Facebook because I was, you know, asking questions about the church, like, what's happening? And they're like, you know, why are you bashing it? I'm not bashing the church, but I'm questioning, what are we doing? People keep asking if the church is dying, if the church is relevant. The church can be full of life. It can be a vital part of our communities, but it can't if it continues in the direction that we're headed in. So questions, comments, concerns. You want to get the book? We got t-shirts. We even have coffee mugs. Because, you know, sometimes you just got to flex at work. Like, I'm UnLynched. I'm not here for the shenanigans. Anybody? Well, if not, I thank you guys so much for being a part of this. I have to prepare for tomorrow, but I did want to share briefly just about the book. And, you know, for anyone who's interested, I would love to host, you know, a book discussion with you. So if you want to get a group together, we even provide like the digital download so that people can, you know, read it. And if they want to get the paperback, then they definitely can. But the biggest thing is just getting the information out and getting people to start thinking about this work in a different way. So I would love to engage with you guys. Feel free to, you guys have my contact information. Feel free to reach out. But thank you so much, Lavon. But thank you guys. I'm going to go and get some rest so that I can be refreshed for another amazing day tomorrow. And again, if you need anything, just reach out. Have a good evening.